this authorized audiobook of the Ancestral Awakening, Healing Generational Wounds. 6. Cosmic Soul Journey series by Seraphina Hartwell is presented by Soul Sanctuary Audio. Copyright Seraphina Hartwell. Introduction. Unearthing. The past to heal the present. The air in the old library was thick with dust, each particle suspended like a ghost of conversations long past. Dr. Elena Marquez sat at a wooden table, her fingers tracing the faded etchings on an ancient leather-bound journal she had unearthed from her grandmother's attic. The pages smelled of time, musty and earthy, and whispered secrets that tugged at something deep within her chest. She wasn't sure why she felt so drawn to this artifact. Perhaps it was the way its brittle edges seemed to hum under her touch, as if alive with memories waiting to be heard. Elena had always been curious about her family history, but never obsessively so. Yet over the last year, strange patterns began surfacing in her life, patterns she couldn't explain. Her recurring nightmares mirrored stories her mother once told her about Great Aunt Rosa, who fled their homeland during wartime. The inexplicable anxiety she felt whenever someone raised their voice echoed tales of her great-grandfather's temper, which had apparently fractured more than one generation. And then there were the silences, the things no one spoke of around the dinner table, the names erased from photo albums, the whispers cut short when children entered the room. As a psychologist specializing in trauma recovery, Elena knew all too well how unresolved pain could ripple through families, shaping lives decades later. Sitting here now, surrounded by artifacts of her ancestors' lives, she realized she hadn't fully grasped the weight of what they carried, or what she might still be. This book is born out of that realization. It seeks to explore the invisible threads connecting us to those who came before us, unraveling the tangled knots of inherited pain and offering pathways toward healing. Through science, spirituality, and storytelling, we'll delve into the ancestral trauma, the idea that our forebears' unhealed wounds can shape our emotions, behaviors, and relationships today. We'll examine the mechanisms behind these transmissions, learn how to recognize them ourselves, and discover tools for breaking free from cycles that no longer serve us. But this isn't just a journey into the past, it's also a call to action for the future. By confronting and healing our generational wounds, we have the power not only to transform our own lives, but also to create a legacy of resilience and wholeness for those who come after us. So let us begin together, peeling back layers of history and memory until we uncover the truth buried beneath. That understanding where we come from is the first step toward deciding where we go next. Part 1. Understanding Ancestral Trauma. In the dim glow of her desk lamp, Elena flipped open the journal and found herself staring at a single line scrawled across the yellowed page. We carry what they cannot bear. At first glance, it sounded poetic, a metaphor, maybe even a bit dramatic. But as she read further, piecing together fragments of letters, diary entries, and sketches, the phrase took on new meaning. These weren't mere words. They were a window into the burdens her ancestors had shouldered and passed down. Ancestral trauma, as Elena would come to define it, refers to the emotional, psychological, and sometimes physical scars left by significant hardships experienced by previous generations. Wars, famines, forced migrations, slavery, genocide. All of these events leave indelible marks not just on individuals, but on entire lineages. They manifest in ways both subtle and overt. Chronic illnesses, unexplained fears, dysfunctional family dynamics, or even societal inequities perpetuated across generations. Take, for example, Elena's own family. As she sifted through the journal, she discovered accounts of her great-great-grandparents fleeing persecution during the Spanish Civil War. Their harrowing escape involved hiding in caves, losing loved ones along the way, and ultimately settling in a foreign land where they struggled to rebuild their lives. While their survival ensured the continuation of their bloodline, the trauma of displacement lingered, embedding itself in the fabric of their descendants' existence. Through vivid anecdotes and scientific insights, this chapter lays the foundation for understanding ancestral trauma, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality affecting millions worldwide. Readers will walk away with a clearer sense of how historical events continue to echo through time, shaping who we are today. 1. What is ancestral trauma? The room was quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall, its steady cadence echoing like a heartbeat in the stillness. Dr. Elena Marquez leaned back in her chair, staring at the journal spread open before her. Its pages were brittle with age, some edges crumbling under her careful touch, but the words etched upon them felt alive, urgent, even. One phrase stood out starkly, written in faded ink. Asterisk, we carry what they cannot bear. Asterisk. Elena traced the sentence with her fingertip, feeling an inexplicable weight settle over her chest. She had always known that history shaped people, that wars and migrations left scars, but she hadn't fully understood how those scars could ripple through generations, embedding themselves into the very fabric of who we are. This wasn't just about remembering, it was about carrying. And as she delved deeper into the journal, she began to see how ancestral trauma, the silent inheritance of pain, had been shaping her own life without her realizing it. Ancestral trauma is more than a concept, it's a living legacy. It begins with events so profound, so devastating, that their echoes reverberate across time. Wars, colonization, slavery, displacement, these aren't just historical footnotes. They are seismic shifts that fracture families and communities, leaving wounds that fester long after the initial violence has ended. Consider the Holocaust survivors whose children grew up grappling with anxiety and hypervigilance, though they themselves had never set foot in a concentration camp. Or the descendants of enslaved Africans, many of whom continue to navigate systemic racism while battling internalized narratives of worthlessness passed down through centuries. These stories aren't isolated incidents. They're threads woven into the tapestry of human experience, connecting us all in ways both visible and unseen. Take, for instance, Elena's great-aunt Rosa, whose name appeared frequently in the journal. Rosa had fled Spain during the Civil War, leaving behind everything she knew to escape persecution. Her journey was marked by loss, of loved ones, of safety, of identity. And yet, when she arrived in a new country, there was no time to grieve. Survival demanded resilience. But resilience came at a cost. Decades later, Elena's mother would recount how Rosa rarely spoke of her past, retreating instead into silence whenever questions arose. That silence became a shadow, lingering over family gatherings, casting doubt and unease where connection should have thrived. Now, sitting amidst fragments of Rosa's story, Elena wondered if her own struggles with trust and vulnerability weren't echoes of that same silence. But ancestral trauma isn't limited to grand historical events. Even smaller-scale tragedies, a parent losing a child, a community displaced by gentrification, or a family torn apart by addiction, can leave indelible marks on future generations. The key lies in understanding how these traumas differ from individual trauma. When someone experiences personal trauma, such as abuse or neglect, the impact is direct and immediate. But ancestral trauma operates differently. It seeps into our lives indirectly, manifesting in patterns we don't recognize as inherited. Perhaps you've noticed recurring themes in your family, cycles of poverty, addiction, or conflict that seem impossible to break. Maybe you've struggled with fears or anxieties that feel disproportionate to your circumstances. These might not be random quirks of personality. They could be whispers of the past, urging you to listen. To illustrate this point, Elena thought of Maria, a client she'd worked with years ago. Maria had come to therapy seeking help for chronic panic attacks that seemed to arise without cause. As they explored her history, a pattern emerged. Maria's grandmother had survived a devastating earthquake in her youth, losing her entire family in the process. Though Maria had never experienced anything remotely similar, her body reacted as though she carried the memory of that catastrophe within her. Through therapy, Maria learned to reframe her panic not as a personal failing but as a response to something far older and deeper. By acknowledging this connection, she was able to begin healing, not just for herself, but for the grandmother whose pain had gone unspoken for so long. What makes ancestral trauma particularly insidious is its invisibility. Unlike physical injuries, which heal with time or treatment, emotional wounds often go untreated, buried beneath layers of denial or shame. Families may avoid discussing painful topics, believing that silence will protect future generations. Yet, paradoxically, this avoidance only perpetuates the cycle. Children grow up sensing the tension in the air, absorbing the unspoken rules of what can and cannot be said. They inherit not only the trauma itself, but also the coping mechanisms, healthy or otherwise, that their ancestors developed to survive. As Elena turned another page of the journal, she found a sketch of a tree, its roots sprawling across the bottom of the page. Someone had written beneath it, *, the roots run deep, but they do not define the branches. *, the image struck her as profoundly hopeful. Yes, ancestral trauma shapes us, but it doesn't have to confine us. Understanding its origins is the first step toward breaking free from its grip. By naming the pain, by giving voice to the silenced stories of our ancestors, we reclaim agency over our lives. We become architects of a new narrative, one rooted in awareness, compassion, and healing. 2. The science behind inherited patterns. The faint hum of the laboratory's fluorescent lights seemed almost deafening in the quiet room as Dr. Elena Marquez scrolled through pages of research on her laptop. Her desk was cluttered with notes, scientific journals, and a half-empty mug of tea that had long gone cold. She paused on an article titled Epigenetic Memory: How Trauma Writes Itself into Our DNA. Its bold headline catching her eye like a flare in the night sky. For years, she had worked as a psychologist, helping individuals navigate their personal traumas. But now, staring at this growing body of evidence, she realized there was another layer to the story, one written not just in memories but in molecules. Elena leaned forward, her brow furrowing as she absorbed the details. Epigenetics, she learned, is the study of how environmental factors like stress, trauma, or even love can alter the way genes are expressed without changing the underlying DNA sequence itself. Imagine your genetic code as a vast library, each book representing a gene. Under normal circumstances, some books remain closed while others are open for reading. However, when someone experiences significant trauma, certain switches flip, opening or closing those books in ways that affect future generations. These changes aren't permanent. They can be reversed, but they linger, silently influencing behavior, health, and emotional responses across lifetimes. One landmark study stood out among the rest. Researchers examining descendants of Holocaust survivors found distinct epigenetic markers associated with heightened stress responses. Even though these individuals hadn't lived through the horrors themselves, their bodies carried traces of their ancestors' suffering. Their cortisol levels were often elevated, making them more prone to anxiety and hypervigilance. Another study focused on Native American communities revealed similar patterns, linking historical displacement and cultural erasure to increased rates of depression and substance abuse today. What struck Elena most about these findings wasn't just their scientific validity, it was their humanity. They painted a picture of resilience marred by unhealed wounds, showing how deeply interconnected we are with those who came before us. But biology isn't the only lens through which ancestral trauma operates. Psychology offers equally compelling insights into how generational wounds take root in our minds. Take attachment theory, for example. Developed by John Bowlby and later expanded upon by Mary Ainsworth, this framework explains how early relationships with caregivers shape our ability to form bonds throughout life. If a parent struggles with unresolved trauma, perhaps stemming from their own upbringing, they may unconsciously pass along insecure attachment styles to their children. This creates a ripple effect, where fear of abandonment, difficulty trusting others, or chronic self-doubt become ingrained patterns within families. Then there's the concept of transgenerational scripts, unspoken rules, or narratives passed down from one generation to the next. These scripts dictate everything from how emotions are expressed or suppressed to what roles family members are expected to play. Elena thought back to her own childhood, recalling how her mother rarely showed anger openly. Instead, frustration would simmer beneath the surface until it erupted in unexpected bursts. As a child, Elena had internalized this pattern, believing that expressing anger directly was dangerous. Only recently, through therapy, had she begun to untangle this inherited script and rewrite it in her own voice. Unconscious inheritance adds yet another layer to the puzzle. Sigmund Freud once posited that repressed memories could resurface in dreams or slips of the tongue, and modern psychologists have expanded on this idea to include collective unconsciousness, a shared reservoir of archetypes and symbols common to all humans. While Freud's theories remain controversial, they underscore the notion that much of what we inherit isn't conscious at all. It lives in the shadows of our psyche, shaping our thoughts and actions in ways we may not fully understand. To bring these abstract concepts to life, Elena turned to case studies that illustrated their real-world implications. One particularly poignant example involved a man named Daniel, whose great-grandparents had survived the Armenian genocide. Growing up, Daniel struggled with intense feelings of guilt whenever he experienced success. Despite excelling academically and professionally, he couldn't shake the belief that he didn't deserve his achievements. During therapy, Daniel uncovered fragments of his family's history, stories of loss, survival, and survivors' guilt passed down like heirlooms. By connecting these dots, he began to see his guilt not as a personal flaw, but as a reflection of his ancestors' unprocessed pain. With time and support, he learned to honor their sacrifices without letting them define him. Another case centered around Sarah, a young woman plagued by panic attacks triggered by seemingly innocuous situations, such as crowded spaces or loud noises. Through therapy, Sarah discovered that her grandmother had endured severe wartime bombings during World War II, leaving her with lifelong PTSD. Though Sarah had never heard these stories directly, her body seemed to carry the memory of them. By exploring this connection, she gained a sense of agency over her reactions, learning techniques to ground herself during moments of distress. As Elena reflected on these examples, she felt a mixture of awe and responsibility. The science behind inherited patterns revealed both the fragility and strength of the human spirit. On one hand, it highlighted how vulnerable we are to the legacies of our ancestors. On the other, it underscored our capacity for healing, not just individually but collectively. Each discovery brought her closer to understanding why breaking free from generational cycles required more than willpower. It demanded awareness, compassion, and intentional action. She glanced at the clock, surprised to find hours had slipped away unnoticed. Outside, twilight painted the sky in hues of lavender and gold, casting long shadows across her workspace. Elena closed her laptop, feeling a renewed determination to share what she'd learned. If knowledge truly was power, Then arming readers with an understanding of these mechanisms could help them reclaim their lives, and perhaps even rewrite their family's story. 3. Recognizing ancestral wounds. In your life, the rain tapped gently against the window pane, a rhythmic patter that seemed to echo Elena's thoughts as she sat cross-legged on her living room floor. Spread out before her were notebooks filled with scribbled reflections, family photographs, and fragments of old letters. She had spent hours piecing together the puzzle of her ancestry, but now it was time to turn inward, to examine how those pieces fit into her own life. It wasn't enough to understand ancestral trauma intellectually. She needed to feel its presence, recognize its fingerprints on her emotions, behaviors, and relationships. Elena picked up a pen and began writing in bold letters at the top of a fresh page. Asterisk, what patterns do I see? Asterisk, the question felt both simple and daunting. Patterns weren't always obvious. They didn't announce themselves with fanfare or clarity. Instead, they lurked in the background, shaping decisions and reactions without conscious awareness. Chronic anxiety, for instance, could stem from unresolved fears passed down through generations. Relationship issues might mirror dynamics played out by parents, grandparents, or even great-grandparents. Self-sabotage often hid beneath layers of inherited guilt or shame. And physical illnesses, they too could carry echoes of ancestral suffering, manifesting as migraines, autoimmune disorders, or chronic fatigue. Take Elena's recurring nightmares, for example. For years, she dismissed them as random figments of her imagination, vague images of running through dark forests or standing on crumbling cliffs. But when she traced these dreams back to stories about her great-aunt Rosa fleeing persecution during wartime, a connection emerged. Her subconscious mind was replaying scenes it had never witnessed firsthand, drawing upon memories stored not in her brain, but in her lineage. These weren't just bad dreams. They were messages begging to be understood. Relationships offered another telling clue. Elena thought about her tendency to withdraw emotionally whenever conflict arose. Growing up, she'd watched her father retreat into silence during arguments, leaving her mother frustrated and unheard. At the time, she assumed this dynamic was unique to their marriage. Yet as she explored her family history, she discovered that her grandfather had exhibited similar behavior, a pattern likely rooted in his own upbringing under authoritarian rule during Franco's Spain. By recognizing this thread, Elena realized she wasn't doomed to repeat it. Awareness gave her the power to choose differently. Self-sabotage proved trickier to untangle. There were moments when everything seemed aligned, opportunities opening up, goals within reach, only for doubt to creep in and derail her progress. Why did she struggle so much with success? A breakthrough came during a therapy session where she recalled a story her grandmother once told. After losing her first child to illness, she vowed never to hope too hard again, fearing the pain of disappointment. That vow, though unspoken, had seeped into Elena's psyche, teaching her to temper ambition with caution. Understanding this allowed her to challenge the belief that success equaled vulnerability. To help readers uncover their own hidden patterns, Elena included practical tools for self-reflection. Journaling became her go-to method, not just jotting down thoughts, but asking pointed questions designed to dig deeper. PR. Umps like asterisk, what fears hold me back? Asterisk, asterisk, how do I handle conflict? Asterisk and asterisk, what stories did my family tell or avoid about hardship? Asterisk encouraged introspection. Guided exercises followed, such as creating a timeline of significant events in one's life alongside key moments in their family history. This visual mapping often revealed startling parallels, highlighting areas where ancestral wounds might still linger. One particularly powerful exercise involved writing letters to ancestors. Elena demonstrated this technique by drafting a letter to her great-aunt Rosa. Asterisk, Dear Rosa, I don't know if you ever found peace after all you endured. I only know that your courage lives on in me, and sometimes it feels heavy. I wake up with fears I can't explain, running from shadows I've never seen. Is this your legacy, or is it mine, to transform? Either way, I want to honor you, not by carrying your pain alone, but by learning to heal it. Asterisk. The act of putting pen to paper unlocked something profound within her. Writing forced her to confront emotions she'd buried deep inside, giving voice to feelings that had no words until now. Real-life examples brought these concepts to life. Elena shared the story of Maya, a client who struggled with debilitating panic attacks triggered by loud noises. Through therapy, Maya uncovered that her great-grandfather had survived artillery bombardments during World War II, leaving him permanently hypersensitive to sound. Though Maya had never heard this story directly, her body carried the memory of it. By acknowledging the link, she began practicing grounding techniques to calm her nervous system, slowly reclaiming control over her responses. Another example centered around James, whose inability to trust others stemmed from his family's history of betrayal. His grandfather had been betrayed by close friends during a political purge, leading to imprisonment and torture. This trauma created an unspoken rule in the family: asterisk, trust no one. Asterisk, James grew up internalizing this script, sabotaging friendships and romantic relationships despite longing for connection. Therapy helped him identify the source of his mistrust, allowing him to rewrite the narrative and build healthier bonds. As Elena reflected on these stories, she realized that recognizing ancestral wounds wasn't about assigning blame. It was about taking responsibility. Each person carried a unique inheritance, shaped by joys and sorrows alike. The goal wasn't to erase the past, but to integrate it, honoring the resilience of those who came before, while forging a new path forward. She closed her notebook and gazed out the window, watching droplets slide down the glass like tears finding their way home. Rain cleansed the earth, washing away debris and nourishing new growth. Perhaps healing worked the same way, not erasing scars, but transforming them into fertile ground for change. Part 2: Breaking Free. From Generational Cycles. The next morning, sunlight streamed through Elena's kitchen window as she spread papers across the table. Beside her sat a laptop displaying a partially completed family tree. Names stretched backward in time, branching off in directions she hadn't anticipated. Some branches ended abruptly, marked with question marks or blank spaces. Others bore annotations like died young, disappeared, or simply unknown. Mapping your family tree, Elena explained, is more than a genealogical exercise. It's a process of reclamation. Each name represents a story, a life lived against the backdrop of its era. To understand the roots of ancestral trauma, you must first know whose footsteps you're following. She started with her maternal grandfather, Francisco, whose stern demeanor had intimidated everyone in the family, including Elena as a child. Digging deeper, she uncovered records of his childhood in rural Spain, where he grew up amidst poverty and political unrest. His father, Antonio, had been imprisoned for speaking out against the regime, leaving Francisco to fend for himself and his siblings. Suddenly, Francisco's stoicism made sense. It wasn't cruelty, but survival. Using practical examples and step-by-step guidance, this chapter empowers readers to embark on their own journeys of discovery. From interviewing relatives to utilizing online databases, Elena provides tools for piecing together fragmented histories while acknowledging the emotional challenges such work may bring. 4. Mapping your family tree. The morning sunlight streamed through the lace curtains of Elena's study, casting delicate shadows across her desk. Before her lay a blank sheet of paper and a freshly sharpened pencil, the tools for an expedition into uncharted territory. She had spent weeks immersing herself in journals, letters, and photographs, but now it was time to take the next step, mapping her family tree. This wasn't just about names and dates. It was about uncovering the stories that connected her to those who came before. Each branch represented not only a person, but a life lived, a tapestry woven with triumphs, losses, joys, and sorrows. Elena began by gathering information, starting with what she already knew. Her maternal grandfather, Francisco, loomed large in her memory. A stern man whose presence commanded respect, but whose eyes often betrayed a quiet sadness. His name went at the top of one branch, followed by his wife, Abuela Maria, whose laughter still echoed in Elena's mind like wind chimes on a summer day. From there, she worked backward, jotting down their parents' names, Antonio and Sofia, and then Antonio's siblings, cousins, and beyond. It felt like piecing together a puzzle, each new name unlocking another fragment of the past. But names alone weren't enough. To truly understand her lineage, Elena needed context, the stories behind the people. So she picked up the phone and called her Aunt Lucia, the keeper of family lore. "Tia," she said after exchanging pleasantries, "can you tell me more about Abuelo Francisco? Why did he leave Spain?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, as if Lucia were sifting through decades of memories stored in dusty corners. Then she began to speak, her voice soft yet steady. "He was only 12 when they fled," Lucia explained. His father, Antonio, had been imprisoned for speaking out against Franco's regime. The family barely escaped with their lives, leaving everything behind: land, livestock, even some of their children. Elena's hand froze mid-sentence. Children left behind. That detail had never come up in family conversations before. As Lucia continued, painting a picture of poverty, fear, and resilience, Elena realized how much of her grandfather's stoicism made sense now. He hadn't been cold or distant. He'd been carrying the weight of survival. Interviewing relatives became a cornerstone of Elena's process. She learned early on that patience was key. Memories are fragile things, prone to fading or distorting over time. Some family members welcomed her questions eagerly, eager to share tales of love and adventure. Others hesitated, guarding secrets they believed were better left buried. When her cousin Miguel refused to discuss their great-uncle Rafael, who vanished without explanation during the Spanish Civil War, Elena didn't push. Instead, she respected his boundaries while quietly noting the omission. Sometimes silence spoke louder than words. Documenting these stories required care and creativity. Elena created a system using notebooks, sticky notes, and digital files to organize her findings. For every anecdote, she noted the source date and any corroborating evidence she could find. Photographs proved invaluable. Faded portraits revealed expressions frozen in time, offering glimpses into personalities long gone. Letters and diaries added depth, their handwritten words imbued with emotion. One particularly poignant entry from her great-grandmother Sophia read, "Asterisk, we carry our home in our hearts, though we may never see it again." Asterisk, those simple words encapsulated the essence of displacement, a theme that resonated deeply within Elena's own life. Technology played a crucial role in expanding her research. DNA testing kits allowed her to confirm connections and discover branches of the family she hadn't known existed. Genealogy websites like Ancestry.com and MyHeritage provided access to census records, immigration documents, and military service files. Through these resources, Elena uncovered surprising details: a great-aunt who emigrated to Argentina, a second cousin living in Australia, and even a distant relative who fought in the American Civil War. Each discovery added texture to her family tree, transforming it from a static diagram into a living narrative. As her tree grew, patterns began to emerge, repeating themes that hinted at ancestral wounds. Poverty appeared frequently, its specter haunting multiple generations. Loss was another constant, whether through death, separation, or exile. And then there were the coping mechanisms: stoicism, secrecy, and an almost obsessive focus on education as a means of upward mobility. These patterns weren't random. They were threads woven into the fabric of her family's identity. By identifying them, Elena gained insight into behaviors and beliefs that had shaped her own upbringing. One evening, as she reviewed her progress, Elena noticed something striking. Many of the men in her family had served as protectors, soldiers, policemen, or community leaders tasked with maintaining order. While this role might seem noble, it also carried burdens. Her grandfather Francisco's authoritarian demeanor likely stemmed from his desire to shield his family from harm, even if it meant suppressing vulnerability. Similarly, her uncle Javier's struggle with anger management could be traced back to the pressure of fulfilling expectations placed upon him as the eldest son. Recognizing these patterns didn't excuse harmful behavior, but it offered compassion, a way to see individuals not as isolated figures, but as products of their circumstances. By the end of her journey, Elena's family tree resembled less a rigid structure and more a sprawling web of interconnected lives. Names were accompanied by brief biographies, photos, and anecdotes, creating a multidimensional portrait of her ancestry. But perhaps the most profound realization came not from the finished product, but from the act of creation itself. Building her family tree forced her to confront uncomfortable truths, celebrate hidden strengths, and acknowledge the resilience passed down through generations. It reminded her that understanding where we come from isn't just about honoring the past, it's about empowering ourselves to shape the future. 5. Rituals and practices for healing. The scent of burning sage filled the small room, its earthy aroma mingling with the faint glow of candlelight. Elena stood in the center of her living room, transformed into a sacred space adorned with objects that carried meaning: a photograph of her great-aunt Rosa, a bundle of dried lavender from her grandmother's garden, and a bowl of water symbolizing clarity and renewal. Around her, the air felt charged, not with tension but with possibility. This was more than an exercise. It was an invitation to connect with those who had come before her, to honor their struggles, and seek release from the pain they'd unknowingly passed down. Healing ancestral wounds required more than intellectual understanding or emotional reflection. It demanded action. Rituals served as bridges between worlds, grounding abstract concepts in tangible practices that could be felt, seen, and experienced. For centuries, indigenous traditions around the globe had recognized this truth, using ceremonies to cleanse, honor, and transform inherited burdens. Elena decided to explore these ancient practices, adapting them to fit her modern context while respecting their origins. One such tradition was smudging, a ritual rooted in Native American cultures where herbs like sage, cedar, or sweetgrass are burned to purify spaces and spirits. As she lit the bundle of sage, Elena whispered a prayer under her breath, a plea for guidance and healing. The smoke curled upward, twisting like ghostly ribbons, carrying her intentions into the ether. She moved slowly through the room, allowing the smoke to drift over every surface, imagining it dissolving layers of unseen residue left by generations of unspoken grief. It wasn't magic exactly, but there was something undeniably powerful about surrendering to the moment, trusting that the act itself held significance beyond logic. 6. Therapy and professional support. The soft hum of the office's white noise machine blended seamlessly with the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall, creating an atmosphere that felt both clinical and calming. Elena sat across from Dr. Nadia Patel, her therapist, in a cozy chair upholstered in muted earth tones. Between them rested a small table holding tissues, a glass of water, and a notebook filled with scribbled thoughts from their previous sessions. Today's conversation would delve into uncharted territory, therapeutic approaches specifically designed to address ancestral trauma. For Elena, this was more than just another step in her healing journey. It was an acknowledgement that some wounds ran too deep to be healed alone. Dr. Patel leaned forward slightly, her warm smile inviting trust. Healing generational pain often requires tools beyond traditional talk therapy, she explained, her voice steady yet gentle. It's about accessing parts of ourselves we may not even realize are carrying these burdens, the body, the subconscious, the collective memory. She paused, letting the words settle before continuing. Let's start with somatic experiencing. Elena tilted her head, intrigued. Somatic experiencing was a term she'd encountered during her research, but hadn't fully understood until now. Developed by Dr. Peter Levine, this approach focuses on releasing stored trauma from the body rather than solely relying on cognitive processing. Trauma, as Dr. Patel explained, isn't just mental. It lives in the nervous system, manifesting as chronic tension, fatigue, or inexplicable physical symptoms. By tuning into bodily sensations and learning to regulate the nervous system, individuals can begin to discharge trapped energy. Prayer circles offered another pathway to connection. Inspired by communal rituals practiced by African diasporic communities and other collective societies, Elena invited a few close friends to join her one evening. They gathered in a circle, each person holding a candle as they shared stories of their own ancestors' resilience. One friend spoke of her grandmother, who had walked miles barefoot to fetch water during apartheid-era South Africa. Another recounted how her great-grandfather had taught himself to read despite laws forbidding enslaved people from doing so. As the stories unfolded, Elena noticed tears streaming down her cheeks, not out of sadness, but out of awe. These weren't just individual triumphs. They were testaments to humanity's capacity to endure and transcend. Together, they closed the circle with a unified prayer, asking not only for personal healing, but for collective liberation. Offerings provided yet another way to honor ancestors. In many Asian cultures, food is placed on altars as a gesture of gratitude and remembrance. Elena decided to create her own makeshift altar, arranging plates of rice, fruit, and bread alongside mementos of her family's history. She included a handwritten note addressed to her great-aunt Rosa, *Thank you for your courage. I see you now, and I carry your strength forward. Placing the offering felt like extending a hand across time, an acknowledgement that though Rosa might never have received recognition in life, her legacy mattered deeply. Modern adaptations expanded these traditional practices, making them accessible to those without direct ties to specific cultural lineages. Meditation became Elena's daily anchor, a practice she used to visualize herself surrounded by light while envisioning her ancestors standing beside her. During one session, she imagined placing heavy stones, representing inherited pain, into a river, watching as the current carried them away. Visualization exercises like this helped her externalize emotions that had long felt internal and inescapable. Altar creation took on new dimensions when paired with intentionality. Elena began building themed altars dedicated to different aspects of her ancestry. One for resilience, another for creativity, and yet another for forgiveness. Each altar featured symbols relevant to its theme: feathers for freedom, paintbrushes for artistic expression, or mirrors for self-reflection. Creating these spaces allowed her to engage with her heritage actively rather than passively, turning remembrance into a living, breathing process. Perhaps the most transformative practice Elena discovered was writing letters to her ancestors. Unlike journaling, which focused inward, letter writing created a dialogue, a chance to speak directly to those whose voices had been silenced by time. Some letters were filled with gratitude, thanking her forebears for their sacrifices and wisdom. Others contained raw honesty, expressing anger or confusion about choices they'd made. Still, others were simple questions. Asterisk, why did you leave? What did you dream of? How can I heal what remains unfinished? Asterisk, writing these letters didn't always bring immediate answers, but it did something equally valuable. It opened channels of communication, reminding Elena that she wasn't alone in her journey. As she continued exploring these rituals, Elena realized their true power lay not in perfection but in participation. There was no right way to honor ancestors. What mattered was showing up with sincerity and openness. Each act, whether lighting a candle, sharing a story, or crafting an altar, was a step toward reclaiming agency over her narrative. By engaging with her lineage in this way, she began to feel less burdened by its weight and more empowered by its richness. By the end of the chapter, readers would find themselves equipped with tools to embark on their own ritualistic journeys. Whether drawing inspiration from indigenous traditions or designing personalized practices, the goal remained the same: to forge connections with ancestors, release inherited pain, and pave the way for healing. For Elena, this work wasn't just about breaking cycles. It was about creating something beautiful from the fragments of the past. And as she extinguished the final candle, she felt a quiet certainty settle within her. The path ahead was still uncertain, but she was no longer walking it alone. To demonstrate, Dr. Patel guided Elena through a simple exercise. Close your eyes, she instructed softly. Take a moment to notice how your body feels right now. Is there tightness anywhere, a heaviness, or perhaps a sense of ease? Elena followed the guidance, her awareness shifting inward. She noticed a familiar knot in her stomach, the same one that appeared whenever she thought about her family's history of displacement. Instead of pushing it away, she allowed herself to sit with it, breathing deeply until the tension began to loosen ever so slightly. It wasn't dramatic, but it was profound, a reminder that her body held answers her mind couldn't always articulate. Next, they explored eye movement desensitization and reprocessing EMDR, a technique pioneered by Francine Shapiro to help process traumatic memories. EMDR works by having clients focus on distressing images or thoughts while engaging in bilateral stimulation, often achieved through guided eye movements, taps, or sounds. The goal is to rewire the brain's response to those memories, reducing their emotional charge over time. During one session, Elena revisited a recurring nightmare where she found herself running through endless corridors, pursued by unseen figures. As she recounted the dream, Dr. Patel handed her 2 small handheld buzzers, one for each hand, and instructed her to follow the alternating vibrations while focusing on specific details of the scene. At first, Elena felt skeptical, wondering how something so mechanical could possibly help. But as the session progressed, the intensity of the nightmare began to fade. What had once felt suffocating now seemed distant, almost dreamlike in its unreality. When the session ended, Elena exhaled deeply, feeling lighter, as though she'd shed a layer of invisible armor she hadn't realized she was wearing. Family constellations, introduced later in her therapy journey, offered yet another lens through which to view ancestral patterns. Developed by Bert Hellinger, this method involves arranging people or objects to represent family members, revealing hidden dynamics and unresolved conflicts within the system. during a group workshop, Elena volunteered to participate in a constellation focused on her maternal lineage. Standing in a circle with strangers who represented various relatives, she watched as the facilitator guided them into positions based on intuitive cues. To her astonishment, the arrangement mirrored tensions she'd observed growing up: her grandfather's isolation, her grandmother's quiet strength, and the void left by ancestors whose stories had been erased. Seeing these relationships play out physically brought clarity to emotions she'd struggled to articulate. It also highlighted areas where reconciliation might still be possible, not necessarily with the living, but with the legacy they carried. While individual therapy provided invaluable insights, working with therapists trained in ancestral healing added another dimension to Elena's journey. These professionals didn't just treat symptoms. They helped clients trace the roots of their struggles back to intergenerational sources. One session stood out vividly. Dr. Patel asked Elena to imagine sitting across from her great-aunt Rosa, asking her questions she'd never dared to ask aloud. Through guided visualization, Elena confronted her ancestors' pain, not as something separate, but as part of her own story. By the end of the exercise, tears streamed down her face, not from grief, but from gratitude. She finally understood that honoring Rosa meant acknowledging her suffering without letting it define her descendants' futures. Group work and community support further enriched Elena's healing process. Joining a monthly circle of individuals exploring ancestral trauma gave her a sense of belonging she hadn't anticipated. Each meeting began with participants sharing updates on their journeys, followed by discussions led by a facilitator well-versed in collective healing practices. One evening, a woman named Clara spoke about discovering letters written by her enslaved ancestors, detailing dreams of freedom denied. Her voice trembled with emotion, yet there was also a fierce determination in her eyes, a resolve to honor their hopes by living boldly. Listening to stories like Clara's reminded Elena that she wasn't alone in her quest for understanding. Shared experiences created bonds stronger than blood, fostering mutual empathy and encouragement. As weeks turned into months, Elena noticed subtle shifts within herself. Conversations that once triggered defensiveness now sparked curiosity. Memories that used to haunt her began to feel less like chains and more like threads connecting her to something larger than herself. Therapy hadn't erased her struggles, but it had given her the tools to navigate them with greater awareness and compassion. Part 3: Forgiveness and Transformation. Late one evening, Elena lit a candle and placed it beside the journal. In front of her lay a stack of handwritten letters addressed to various ancestors. Writing to them had become part of her nightly ritual, a way to release pent-up emotions and forge connections across time. Forgiveness, she realized, was not about excusing harmful actions or erasing painful memories. Rather, it was about releasing the grip those memories held over her present. When she wrote to her great-aunt Rosa, apologizing for judging her choices without knowing her struggles, tears streamed down her face. For the first time, she saw Rosa not as a distant figure shrouded in mystery, but as a woman doing her best under unimaginable circumstances. This chapter delves into the transformative power of forgiveness, blending personal reflection with expert advice. Readers will learn techniques for cultivating compassion, not just for others but for themselves, as they navigate the complexities of ancestral healing. Through Elena's journey, they'll witness how forgiveness opens doors to freedom, allowing individuals to step into their true potential. By weaving narrative, research, and actionable steps throughout these sections, the book creates a cohesive yet dynamic exploration of ancestral trauma and healing. Each chapter builds upon the last, guiding readers toward greater self-awareness and empowerment while maintaining continuity with the overarching themes of recognition, release, and renewal. 7. The power of forgiveness. The air in the small meditation room was cool and still, carrying with it the faint scent of sandalwood from incense that had burned earlier. Elena sat cross-legged on a cushion, her hands resting lightly on her knees, palms facing upward. Before her lay a single sheet of paper, a letter she had written to her great-aunt Rosa. Its words were raw, unfiltered, a mixture of gratitude and frustration, love and longing. She hadn't planned to read it aloud today, but something inside her whispered that it was time. Forgiveness wasn't just an idea. It was a practice, one she knew she needed to embrace if she wanted to truly heal. Forgiveness, as Elena had come to understand it, wasn't about excusing harmful actions or pretending wounds didn't exist. It wasn't condoning the injustices her ancestors endured or inflicted, but rather releasing the grip those injustices held over her present. Resentment, guilt, anger, they weren't shackles placed upon her by others. They were chains she carried willingly, believing they protected her from further pain. But what if letting go wasn't weakness? What if it was freedom? Dr. Patel's voice echoed in her mind during their last session. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing not to let the past dictate your future. Those words resonated deeply now as Elena unfolded the letter. Her eyes scanned the lines she'd penned days ago, each sentence a thread connecting her to Rosa's life and her own. Dear Rosa, the letter began, asterisk, I don't know how you survived. I only know that you did. And because of you, I'm here. But sometimes I feel like I'm carrying more than I can bear. The silence, the fear, the weight of all you couldn't say. I want to forgive you. Not for leaving me this legacy, but for teaching me how to carry it differently. Asterisk. Her throat tightened as she read the final line aloud, her voice trembling slightly. Saying the words out loud felt different than writing them. It made forgiveness tangible, real. It wasn't easy. In fact, it was excruciating. How could she forgive someone who hadn't asked for it? Someone whose choices had shaped her life in ways she might never fully comprehend? Yet, as the sound of her own voice filled the quiet room, she realized forgiveness wasn't really for Rosa at all. It was for herself. Cultivating forgiveness required intentionality, practical steps rooted in self-compassion and patience. One method Elena found particularly transformative was using affirmations. Each morning, she stood before her altar and repeated phrases designed to reframe her relationship with her ancestors. Asterisk, I release what no longer serves me. Asterisk, asterisk, their pain does not define me. Asterisk, asterisk, I honor their strength while creating my own path. Asterisk. At first, these declarations felt hollow, almost performative. But over time, they began to sink into her subconscious, softening the sharp edges of resentment and replacing them with a sense of agency. Rituals also played a crucial role in her journey toward forgiveness. Inspired by indigenous traditions, Elena incorporated offerings into her daily routine. On certain evenings, she would place a cup of tea beside Rosa's photograph, imagining the act as a gesture of reconciliation. Other nights, she performed a ritual called cord cutting, visualizing thick ropes binding her to ancestral pain, dissolving under golden light. These practices weren't magical solutions. They didn't erase the hurt, but they created space for new possibilities, allowing her to step into forgiveness gradually rather than all at once. Inner dialogue proved equally vital. Elena noticed how often her thoughts spiraled into judgment, not just toward her ancestors, but toward herself. Why hadn't she recognized these patterns sooner? Why did she keep repeating behaviors she despised? Guilt and shame became barriers to forgiveness, convincing her she wasn't worthy of liberation. To counteract this, She began journaling conversations between her current self and her younger self, offering kindness where criticism once lived. "You did the best you could with what you knew," she wrote one evening. Asterisk, "and now you get to choose differently." Asterisk slowly, these compassionate exchanges rewrote the narrative she carried within her. Resistance to forgiveness, however, remained a formidable obstacle. Anger flared unpredictably, especially when memories surfaced of moments she felt abandoned or betrayed by her family's inability to confront their pain. Fear whispered warnings that forgiving meant forgetting, that releasing resentment equated to erasing history. Guilt layered itself atop everything else, reminding her of privileges she hadn't earned and struggles she hadn't faced. Overcoming these emotions demanded courage, a willingness to sit with discomfort without retreating into denial. One breakthrough came during a guided visualization exercise led by Dr. Patel. Elena imagined standing at the edge of a vast ocean, waves crashing against the shore. In her hands, she held stones etched with names: Rosa, Francisco, Antonio, Sophia, all the ancestors whose legacies shaped her life. With each breath, she tossed a stone into the water, watching ripples spread outward. Some stones sank quickly, others lingered near the surface, resisting the pull of the tide. When she reached the final stone, her own name, she hesitated. Could she forgive herself for carrying so much anger, for failing to see her ancestors' humanity sooner? Taking a deep breath, she released it into the waves, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. Forgiveness wasn't linear. It ebbed and flowed like the tides. But every act of letting go brought her closer to peace. By the end of this chapter, readers will walk away with practical tools to navigate their own journeys toward forgiveness. Whether through affirmations, rituals, or inner dialogue, the message is clear. Forgiveness is not a destination, but a process, one that requires vulnerability, persistence, and grace. For Elena, this work wasn't just about breaking free from inherited burdens. It was about reclaiming her story, rewriting it with compassion instead of condemnation. As she folded the letter to Rosa and placed it back on the altar, she felt lighter, not because the past had changed, but because her relationship to it had. And in that shift, she discovered hope, not just for herself, but for generations yet to come. 8. Rewriting your legacy. The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of Elena's study, casting golden streaks across her desk. She sat with a blank journal open before her, its pristine pages waiting to be filled. This moment felt different from all the others, less about uncovering what had been and more about deciding what could be. After months of excavating her family's history, confronting ancestral wounds, and learning to forgive, she now stood at a crossroads. The question wasn't just who am I, but who do I want to become, and what legacy will I leave behind? Rewriting one's legacy isn't an act of erasure. It's an act of creation. It requires setting intentions, not vague hopes or fleeting desires, but deliberate choices rooted in clarity and purpose. For Elena, this process began with a simple yet profound exercise, defining the values she wanted to embody and pass on to future generations. She picked up her pen and wrote at the top of the page, asterisk, what kind of ancestor do I want to be? Asterisk. The words hung there, heavy with possibility. Beneath them, she listed qualities that resonated deeply within her: resilience, compassion, curiosity, courage. Each trait represented not only who she aspired to be, but also the foundation upon which she hoped to build a brighter future for those who would come after her. Setting intentions was only the beginning. To truly rewrite her legacy, Elena knew she needed to live those intentions every day, especially in her relationships with others. As someone who dreamed of starting a family someday, She understood the weight of mindful parenting. Children don't just inherit DNA. They absorb the emotional climate of their homes, the unspoken rules, and the patterns modeled by their caregivers. If she wanted to break cycles of silence, fear, or mistrust, she had to approach parenthood or mentorship with intentionality and awareness. Elena thought back to her own childhood, the moments when her father retreated into stoic silence during conflict, leaving her mother frustrated and unheard. Those dynamics hadn't disappeared overnight, but through therapy and self-reflection, she'd learned healthier ways to navigate disagreements. Now, she envisioned herself teaching a child, or perhaps mentoring a young person, how to express emotions openly, how to listen without judgment, how to embrace vulnerability as strength rather than weakness. These lessons wouldn't guarantee perfection, but they would plant seeds of change, offering tools to handle life's inevitable challenges with grace. Mindful mentorship extended beyond parenting. 2. Elena reflected on the impact her high school art teacher, Mrs. Alvarez, had once had on her. Mrs. Alvarez didn't just teach techniques. She nurtured creativity, encouraging students to see mistakes as opportunities for growth. That philosophy stayed with Elena long after graduation, shaping how she approached both personal and professional endeavors. Inspired by Mrs. Alvarez's example, Elena resolved to pay it forward, to seek out ways to guide and support younger generations, whether through formal roles like teaching or informal ones like volunteering or simply being present for friends' children. Every interaction mattered because every interaction carried the potential to inspire transformation. Celebrating progress became another cornerstone of rewriting her legacy. Healing wasn't linear, and neither was legacy building. There were days when old habits crept back in, when guilt or anger threatened to derail her hard-won peace. But instead of fixating on setbacks, Elena chose to acknowledge milestones, no matter how small. One evening, she lit a candle and wrote a list titled Moments of Growth. On it, she included everything from completing her first EMDR session to apologizing sincerely after losing her temper with a friend. Reading over the list reminded her of how far she'd come, reinforcing her belief that even incremental changes could ripple outward, touching lives in ways she might never fully understand. To deepen this practice, Elena decided to create a legacy box, inspired by traditions she'd read about in various cultures. Into the box, she placed items symbolizing her journey: a dried sage bundle from her smudging ritual, a handwritten letter to Rosa, a photograph of her grandmother Maria smiling beside a garden she'd tended with love. She also added notes addressed to her future self, or perhaps to someone else entirely, words of encouragement meant to remind whoever found them that healing was possible, that resilience could flourish even in broken soil. The act of assembling the box felt sacred, like sealing a time capsule filled not with regrets, but with hope. As she closed the lid, Elena realized something important. Rewriting her legacy wasn't solely about protecting future generations from inherited pain. It was about equipping them with the tools to face their own struggles with courage and compassion. Her ancestors hadn't chosen the hardships they endured, but she could choose how she responded to them. By embracing forgiveness, fostering connection, and committing to conscious living, she was crafting a narrative that honored the past while envisioning a better tomorrow. 9. Building a community of healing. The faint hum of conversation filled the cozy meeting room, punctuated by occasional laughter and the clinking of coffee mugs. Elena sat at a round table surrounded by strangers turned allies, people from diverse backgrounds united by a shared desire to heal not only themselves but also their families, communities, and societies. The air buzzed with an unspoken understanding. No one carried ancestral wounds alone. These burdens were collective, shaped by histories larger than any single life, yet they found resolution not in isolation but in connection. This realization had brought Elena here, to a monthly gathering called Roots and Resilience, a community dedicated to breaking cycles of generational trauma through storytelling, advocacy, and mutual support. Healing, as Elena had come to understand it, wasn't just personal, it was profoundly communal. While her journey thus far had focused inward, exploring her family's history and confronting her own inherited pain, she now recognized that true transformation required looking outward, too. Generational trauma didn't exist in a vacuum. It thrived on societal structures, racism, poverty, displacement, oppression, that perpetuated suffering across generations. To dismantle these cycles, individuals needed to join forces, creating networks of solidarity where healing could flourish collectively. One of the most powerful ways to build such networks was through support groups, workshops, and online communities. At first, Elena hesitated to attend Roots and Resilience. Sharing her story felt vulnerable, almost risky. What if others judged her? What if her experiences seemed insignificant compared to theirs? But when she finally mustered the courage to speak during her second meeting, something remarkable happened. A woman named Maya nodded knowingly after Elena described her struggle with inherited anxiety. "I feel that," Maya said softly. "My great-grandparents survived partition in India, and I've spent years untangling how their loss shaped my sense of belonging." Another participant, Jamal, chimed in, recounting how his family's legacy of resilience under apartheid inspired him to pursue social justice work. Their stories weren't identical to hers, but they resonated deeply, weaving threads of commonality into a tapestry of shared humanity. These connections extended beyond physical spaces. Online forums and virtual workshops provided additional avenues for engagement, especially for those unable to attend in person. Elena joined a Facebook group called Ancestral Awakening, where members posted reflections, resources, and questions about their journeys. One thread stood out, a post by a young Indigenous woman named Ayana, who wrote about reclaiming her cultural identity after decades of forced assimilation policies had silenced her ancestors' voices. Reading her words stirred something within Elena, reminding her that healing wasn't just about individual liberation, but also about restoring what systemic violence had sought to erase. Engaging with others online allowed her to expand her perspective, learning from traditions and struggles vastly different from her own, while finding universal truths in their shared quest for wholeness. Advocacy and activism emerged naturally from this growing awareness. As Elena deepened her understanding of ancestral trauma, she couldn't ignore the broader systems perpetuating it. Colonialism, slavery, war, displacement. All of these historical injustices continued to reverberate today, manifesting in inequities like mass incarceration, educational disparities, and healthcare access gaps. Breaking generational cycles meant addressing these root causes head-on, advocating for policies and practices that dismantled oppressive structures rather than reinforcing them. Inspired by her newfound community, Elena began volunteering with a local organization focused on racial equity and intergenerational healing. They hosted workshops designed to educate participants about the intersection of personal trauma and systemic oppression, emphasizing the importance of allyship and accountability. During one session, she facilitated a discussion on epigenetics and its implications for marginalized communities, drawing parallels between scientific research and lived experience. Seeing participants connect the dots between their individual struggles and larger societal patterns ignited a spark within her, a reminder that change started small but rippled outward, touching lives in ways both seen and unseen. Creating safe spaces for storytelling became another cornerstone of collective healing. Stories held power. They validated experiences, fostered empathy, and challenged dominant narratives that often dismissed or erased marginalized voices. In collaboration with other members of Roots and Resilience, Elena helped organize a storytelling event titled Echoes of Our Ancestors. Participants were invited to share tales of resilience, loss, and hope using the most authentic medium: spoken word, music, visual art, or dance. On the night of the event, the room brimmed with emotion as each storyteller took the stage. One man performed a hauntingly beautiful song inspired by letters written by his enslaved ancestors. Another woman recited a poem honoring her grandmother's quiet strength in the face of domestic abuse. Each story added depth and texture to the collective narrative, affirming that healing wasn't just about moving forward. It was about remembering, honoring, and celebrating the legacies carried within us all. As the evening drew to a close, Elena stepped outside into the cool night air, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. She thought back to the early days of her journey, when the weight of her family's history had felt isolating, insurmountable. Now, standing among people committed to rewriting their legacies together, she realized that healing wasn't a solitary endeavor. It was a shared responsibility, a call to action. By building communities rooted in compassion, accountability, and justice, they were breaking cycles of trauma. They were forging pathways toward collective liberation. Conclusion: a new dawn for future generations. The first light of dawn stretched across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose. Elena stood on her balcony, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands, as she watched the world awaken. It was a quiet moment, yet it felt monumental, a culmination of everything she had uncovered, confronted, and transformed over the past months. The journey hadn't been easy. There were nights when the weight of ancestral wounds seemed unbearable, days when doubt whispered that healing was impossible. But here she was, standing at the edge of a new beginning, not just for herself, but for those who would come after her. Addressing ancestral trauma wasn't merely an act of introspection. It was an act of revolution. By tracing the roots of inherited pain, Elena had unearthed truths that once lay buried beneath silence and shame. She learned how wars, displacement, and systemic injustices shaped her ancestors' lives, emotions, behaviors, and relationships. Through rituals, therapy, forgiveness, and community, she discovered tools to release what no longer served her, while honoring the resilience passed down through generations. This process wasn't about erasing history. It was about transforming its legacy, turning scars into stories, burdens into bridges. The transformative power of this work extended far beyond individual healing. As Elena reflected on her experiences, she realized that addressing ancestral trauma offered a blueprint for collective change. When people dared to confront their inherited wounds, they didn't just free themselves, they created ripples of liberation that touched everyone around them. Imagine a world where families spoke openly about their struggles instead of hiding behind walls of silence. Where communities worked together to dismantle systems of oppression rather than perpetuating cycles of harm. Where future generations inherited not pain but possibility, not fear but freedom. That vision wasn't utopian. It was achievable, one courageous step at a time. Yet, the journey didn't end here. Healing wasn't a destination, but a lifelong commitment to growth, awareness, and compassion. There would still be moments of resistance, times when old patterns resurfaced or new challenges arose. But Elena knew now that setbacks weren't failures. They were invitations to deepen her practice, to return to the tools and insights she'd gathered along the way. Whether through journaling, meditation, therapy, or connecting with others, she understood that staying engaged was the key to sustaining progress. And so, she encouraged readers to do the same. Remain curious, stay vulnerable, and trust in their capacity to heal. Her mind drifted to the legacy she hoped to leave behind, a legacy defined not by the traumas she carried, but by the choices she made in response to them. She envisioned grandchildren sitting around a table someday, listening as she shared stories not of loss but of triumph, not of silence but of voice. She imagined them growing up in a world where generational wounds were acknowledged and healed, where empathy replaced judgment, and where peace became more than an aspiration, it became reality. This vision wasn't hers alone. It belonged to every reader who had embarked on this journey alongside her, every person brave enough to face their ancestry and rewrite their story. Together, they could create a future where the echoes of the past no longer dictated the rhythm of life, but harmonized with the melody of renewal. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting golden light over the city below, Elena took a deep breath, feeling the promise of a new dawn settle within her chest. The road ahead would require courage, persistence, and grace, but she was ready. For herself, for her ancestors, and for all those yet to come, she stepped forward into the light, carrying hope like a torch. And so, dear reader, may you do the same. May you continue to unearth the truths hidden within your lineage, honor the strength of those who came before you, and forge a path toward wholeness for yourself and future generations. In doing so, you contribute to a world where healing isn't just possible, it's inevitable. Final notes. As the final words of this manuscript take shape, it's worth pausing to reflect on the journey we've embarked upon together. Writing The Ancestral Awakening, Healing Generational Wounds has been more than an intellectual exercise. It has been a labor of love, empathy, and hope. This book is not merely a collection of ideas. It is a living guide designed to accompany readers as they navigate the intricate terrain of ancestral trauma and healing. Each chapter has been carefully crafted to build upon the last, creating a seamless arc that moves from awareness to understanding and finally to action. From the quiet moments of introspection in Chapter 1, where readers first encounter the concept of ancestral trauma, to the transformative power of forgiveness explored in Chapter 7, every step has been intentional. The narrative weaves together personal stories, scientific research, and actionable tools, ensuring that the content resonates on both an emotional and practical level. By integrating rituals, therapy, community building, and advocacy, the book offers a holistic approach to healing, one that honors the past while empowering the present and safeguarding the future. The pacing of the chapters mirrors the natural progression of a healing journey. Early sections focus on recognition and reflection, laying the groundwork for deeper exploration. Middle chapters delve into specific practices and therapeutic modalities, providing readers with tangible steps to address their inherited wounds. Later segments expand the lens, emphasizing collective healing and the importance of breaking societal cycles. Throughout, the tone remains compassionate yet firm, encouraging readers to confront difficult truths without becoming overwhelmed by them. The Ancestral Awakening, Healing Generational Wounds. 6. Cosmic Soul Journey series by Seraphina Hartwell is presented by Soul Sanctuary Audio. Copyright Seraphina Hartwell.